Tonight's presenter is Dr. Nancy Keogh, a religious of the Sacred Heart, who received her PhD in psychology from Boston College in 1974. She's an instructor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Cambridge Health Alliance and at Harvard Medical School. Sister Keogh has worked for 23 years in the field of mental health and has been a pioneer in incorporating spiritual beliefs and values in treating the mentally ill. She developed a comprehensive religious history assessment tool, which she includes in her training programs for staff in mental health, geriatric, and medical settings. There will be an opportunity for questions after the presentation, and without further ado, I'm very pleased to present Sister Nancy Keogh.
Thank you, Susan. Actually, what I like to do whenever I begin a presentation is to entertain some questions from the audience, because I'm always interested in knowing why people come out to something. And on a night like tonight, I'm very interested to know why you've come out to this. So it also gives me a feeling for kind of what are the questions on people's minds, and I will incorporate them into either my talk or I will certainly address them at the end of the evening. But I'd just like to know, given the way the blurb was described, what, outside of the fact that you're on the Spiritual Life Committee and maybe had to come, what questions do you come with? What do you hope that you can learn tonight?
I came because the list of things that, you're concerned with, depression, bipolar, eating disorder, alcoholism, it sounds like a list of my family's, a portrait of my family, both extended family and immediate family. And I guess one of the things that I'm kind of interested in hearing about is how important is your faith when you're struggling either yourself with these kind of really life, they affect your quality of life so terribly, whether it's yourself or a family member. How plausible can a person still feel a belief in a personal God when they're struggling with these kinds of things? So I just was interested in hearing maybe a few words of hope or something.
Well, as a member of the Spirituality Committee, I came tonight to see if we could get some background that we could use when we're setting up events for the alumni, to make sure that we get a spiritual component in it.
But how does that relate to mental illness or mental health?
Well,
if you think of programs for the alumni.
Well, I think having an expansion of those topics so we would know
Oh, I see.
Just how to focus on events.
Just building on that, I'd say in relation to building healthy lifestyles. But for myself, I'm also a hospital chaplain, and I see people not only with physical illness, but accompanying depression and so forth, and their spirituality really, in many instances, starts to wane or go down the tubes. And so I'd be curious on what you have to say about that one thing.
Yes.
Forgive my cold. I'm a graduate of Newton Country Day School, so it's the neighborhood for me. But I'm also an acupuncturist, and I run a nonprofit organization, which I began several years ago, which is designed to provide education and awareness about the Oriental healing arts. And one of the things we're interested in doing is providing public forums pro bono to organizations about the 12 healing arts, of which acupuncture would be one. So it seemed appropriate for me to come and garner some information about what you do.
Oh, good. Okay.
cases where the patient becomes hyper-religious, how do you know, like, what is real and, like, what has your experience been with, like, hyper-religious as characteristic of mental illness?
Yes.
I'm in the IREPM Pastoral Ministry Program, and actually missed your talk with John McDowell last year for a similar night.
That's right, that was a terrible night.
Yeah. So aside from a professional interest for future ministry, and being interested personally in the intersection of psych and spirituality, I've had a couple of conversations with a very dear friend who's suffered from depression for about 20 years. And her experience was, before going on medication, she was very mystical. She was very, she describes it as a mystical relationship with God. And she talks often about missing that, and that medication to attenuate the depression has, in her mind, sort of quelched her much deeper spiritual experiences before. And she's actually thought about, should I just ditch the medication? So, we've had those conversations. I'd be curious to know what you think about that.
Do you know the book Lying Awake?
No.
Okay, I'll mention it. Okay, one more question? Yes.
Just wanna, I thought it'd be interesting to, how do you, in a clinical setting, how do you balance the spirituality and the psychology of dealing with patients?
My handwriting gets worse as I go on. Yes, okay,
Yes,
last
I'm-
question.
I'd be interested in any comments you might have on dealing with the psychiatric, people in the psychiatric field who are hostile or not encouraging of any spirituality.
You hire me to talk to them.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that will give us a little bit of food for thought. I was going to begin with the question, I'll ask the question, but I'm not going to ask for a response. But in general, if you were asked how many people that you knew, either in your family or close associations, who had heart disease, cancer, diabetes, liver malfunctions, whatever, I think that you would be very ready to respond. But if you were asked the same question about how many people in your family or people that you are very close to have mental illness, you would be less likely to respond. Because there still, I think, is that onus about mental illness. And that's part of what I would like to try to address tonight in terms of a stigma. What I'm going to do is, I want to give you a little bit of background on why the current intertwining of spirituality and religion is kind of a new phenomenon, but actually, historically, it's only in the last 100 years that the two were separated. So I'm just going to put what I'm doing in a little bit of a context. But let me just go back a little bit and say a little bit more about myself and why I got into this. And I think in some ways that will address some of the questions that we're already talking about. When I finished my doctorate at Boston College, after teaching a year at Weston at the Jesuit School of Theology, I left there and went to Cambridge Hospital to do a postdoctoral internship. And while I was there, I began to realize with some curiosity that no one ever mentioned anything about religion or spirituality. And in 1976, people weren't even distinguishing between religion and spirituality as they are now. So my question was, why are people excluding the idea of religion in a person's clinical history, particularly when it seemed pertinent to the situation that the person was presenting? For example, an Irish Catholic law student at Harvard who was depressed and who had had an abortion. And no one explored, was there any relationship between her religious background, her depression, and her decision to have an abortion? So as I listened to more and more situations in which that was true, I began to raise the question of what it meant that people were leaving out this very important part of a person's life. Now, I had come from all my years in religious life, but I also had a grandfather who had suffered with depression and was hospitalized twice. I had lived with many religious in community who had a mental illness. And so I knew from experience that mental illness and religion could go hand in hand, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. So I began to raise the question of what it meant that this was being omitted. And it was out of that conversation, as I started to talk with people, that I developed this religious history assessment tool, which basically is simply a series of questions to give clinicians a language in which they could feel comfortable talking with people about this area. Because most of them didn't. I mean, most of them felt, you asked a person if you were Jewish, Catholic, or Protestant, if they even asked that, and then that was it. They didn't feel that comfortable to ask if a person prayed, and I thought that was kind of curious since they asked all kinds of questions about sexuality, money, politics, work, history, abuse history, but they wouldn't feel comfortable saying to a person, do you believe in God? Do you pray? What is that like for you? So that's why I developed this questionnaire. And it was after doing a lot of consultations with people in that setting and then in other settings in different hospitals in Boston that I was asked to do a consultation at a psychiatric day treatment program in 1981 and to resolve an impasse between a Jewish therapist and a very Lutheran client. And the client wanted the therapist to convert so that he could do therapy with her. And as I always say, nothing was happening, therapy or conversion. They were just at a dead end. So after that conversation, I said that I thought it would be kind of interesting to have a group that was dedicated to talking about religious issues with the clients. Well, in 1981, that was really unheard of, that people were not having that kind of, and I thought it was just in Cambridge that people weren't having those conversations. Well, then I learned that no place in the country were people having those conversations with people with serious mental illness. So I began to do the group, and 23 years later, I'm still doing those groups. And it's really out of that experience that I'm in the process of writing a book about. The men and women that I've encountered, and many of the questions that you've raised tonight. In doing that, I think what I've learned is a lot about how people with mental illness, serious mental illness, think about religion and spirituality. So that's kind of the context in which I come to this conversation. That's the background. Now, if we look just very briefly at the history of religion and psychology as it goes back over the years, it really, as I said earlier, it wasn't until the 19th century that the separation took place. That prior to that, in the Greco-Roman world, in the medieval world, in the Renaissance, even as late as the 18th century, religion and mental illness were thought about together. Now, sometimes they were thought about positively, so people would take people who were mad to the temples and pray for healing, just as they brought, clay body parts to the temple to ask for healing for, liver, breast, arm, whatever. They would bring people who were mad to the temple and ask for healing. We're all familiar with the way in which, in the scriptures, it's not referred to as mental illness, but it's referred to as demonic possession. So the sense of interpreting mental illness either as a demonic possession, as something that the demons were involved in, which then would require healing, or think that the spiritual and religious part could bring healing to the person. So that was really the trend that was present in, so it was the interpretation of it, and then it was a way to have a cure in relationship to it. For people like George Fox, who was the founder of the Quakers, he was very invested in the whole idea of praying for people who had a mental illness as well as a physical illness. So you have these two kind of ways of thinking about it. In the late 18th century, there was a man named Pinel who was a French physician and psychiatrist, and curiously enough, he had started out thinking that he would choose religion as a career for himself, and then he decided not to do that, and he became a doctor, and then he became actually one of the founders of psychiatry. But even with this background, he said, and I quote, that people who were religiously preoccupied should be separated from other patients, and that every opportunity should be taken to make adverse comparisons between the distinguished acts of humanity and patriotism and the pious and delirious extravagance of the saints. So you have kind of a beginning of saying, these two things should be kept apart. In contrast to that, Benjamin Rush, who was the father of American psychiatry, believed that people had a believing faculty that could be diseased, as well as another part of their mind that could be diseased, and that people should pay attention to both, that illness could cause disbelief as well as it could cause aberrant behavior. But it was really only in the 19th century, in the latter part of the 19th century, with the whole rationalistic and scientific approach to medicine and to psychology, that a real split began to occur. And of course, then with Freud, who termed religion an illusion, it really became a separation. So you had schools of psychology and training in psychiatry that looked at the scientific approach to illness. And then you had the philosophy and the religious schools that were looking at kind of how we think about human beings. And really from that point, there was a division. So since that time, really until, I would say, the last 20 years, in training in psychology and psychiatry and social work, religion was not introduced in any way, shape, or form. And I've tested this out with any number of people that, when I've done programs and asked people if they received any knowledge about that in their training. By and large, absolutely not. The one area, social work to some extent, some of the time, and nursing, because there people are interested in kind of the holistic part of a person, that getting the psychosocial history of a person. But in psychiatry and psychology, it was absolutely a separation. So that people, and the only way, it was a separation in the sense of thinking that there was anything positive about it. The only way that it was included was in a pathological way. So up until there's a book called the DSM, and it's a Diagnostic Statistic Manual, and it's the manual that mental health people use to categorize mental illness. And so you get the diagnosis: a person's depressed if they follow these 5 criteria, a person is schizoaffective disorder if they follow these 5 criteria. So it's kind of a recipe book for a mental illness. So and then clinicians put down those categories. Up until the most recent one, which was the DSM-4, and then there's been an adaptation, all the references to religion were pathological. So it was grandiosity, hyper-religiosity, denial, illusion, paranoid thinking, whatever. There was nothing redeeming about it. There was nothing positive about it. So that's a little bit, and one other quote that I want to give you, and then I'm going to move on, that in 1984, the National Academy of Science, in an article that was published by them, said, and I quote, "Religion and science are mutually exclusive realms of thought, whose presentation in the same context leads to misunderstanding of both scientific theory and religious belief." Now, even though that was in a strictly scientific form, that really was the idea, I think, in mental health care. You don't bring this up because it's problematic. If it comes up by a patient, then it's a part of their illness. So that's kind of the background at which I naively launched into this world and said, why don't we ask questions about religion and spirituality? Now, I think that with all the research that's been done and all the discovery of new medications, there have been great advances made in relation to mental illness, that people no longer have to anticipate 20 and 30 years in an institution when they're diagnosed with a mental illness, that medication, day treatment programs, residential programs, more humane forms of treatment really allow people to get a life. But there still is, I think, the stigma connected with mental illness, that the shame, the sense of embarrassment. And one person said when I was giving a talk, mental illness is a no casserole disease. And what she meant by that was when a person is diagnosed with mental illness, people don't rush in with casseroles. You know, when a person is diagnosed with cancer, the neighborhood, the friends come around, you know. And what happens when a family member is diagnosed with mental illness is that everybody withdraws. The people outside the family withdraw and the family withdraws. Because there still is a sense of shame connected with it for some reason, or an unknown. It's like, there's something wrong, but we're embarrassed by it. You know, we don't talk easily about a family member who has mental illness as we might as a family member who has cancer, heart disease, or whatever. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to read two poems of people that I've worked with, because I think they capture some of this reality. And then I'm going to talk about three of the people that I've worked with over the years. And then I'm going to address your questions, and then we'll see what else this raises for you in terms of other thoughts. This first poem is called For My Friend. There is a pull to life unending, like honeysuckle in the summer air, like kittens bounding in the clouds, and the dreams of dreams come true so rare. The pink embrace of roses, feathers of time, time to prepare. Noble horses fly through canyons, and art is our heart, and heart so fair. When cruel, surreal nightmares seize me, when I am mauled by black despair, I reach to find the truth unfailing, reach to feel our pulse prevail. There is a pull to life unending, and honeysuckle in the summer air. And this other is a little bit less of a poem and more of a kind of a free association. She says, "We are the struggling ones. Not that people without mental illness don't struggle, but ours is more exemplified. All life's daily problems on top of stresses and symptoms leave us hidden from the world, relatives that fail to see the beauty in us, but only see the symptoms which leave them scared and estranged from us. We all have different symptoms. Some deal with mania, others with deep depression, still others with anxiety and suicide, and then again some with psychosis and paranoia. All have different coping skills, some better than others. But yet with all these varieties, we are basically kind people, easily hurt by condescension, prejudice, and being treated as less than human." Now, the first person that I want to talk about, and I think she really does address some of the questions that you have raised. This woman's name is Barbara, and she gave me permission a long time ago to use her name because she said, at this point in my life, anonymity is no longer an issue. That if you can use anything that I've done for the sake of other people, you have my permission. She was a member of one of my groups for a couple of years. And at that time, when she joined the group, she had never, ever been asked anything about her religion or spirituality in all of her years in the psychiatric setting. She was in my group for a while, and then she moved out of the program. She was doing a lot better. She lived in a halfway house. And I think it was probably about 6 years ago, she died of cancer. She had had 2 bouts with cancer and died as a result of the second one. After her death, I learned that she had willed me all of her journals. She had one of those plastic crates, and she had 25 spiral 3-ring notebooks, journals that she had kept faithfully over the years. Now, what's remarkable about just that fact alone is that she was in and out of hospitals. She was in and out of different residential programs. She was in and out of halfway houses. I don't think she was ever homeless, but she had to move around a lot. And just the fact that she kept these journals was remarkable. She also kept a small library, which she carried around in a brown paper bag. And in that library, she had books by John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, the 12-Step Program, books, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Understanding Evil in the Universe. She was a very intelligent woman, and she also willed me that. When she willed me that material, I thought, I really need to do something with this, So that's really what kind of got me started on the idea of the book. But in terms of her own life, she was a woman who had graduated from Wellesley. She was a beautiful woman, very smart, very gifted in terms of writing, and after her graduation from Wellesley, had the first breakdown. And she's someone who, from that time, when she was 22 until she died at 60, was in and out of the mental health system. I mean, basically in it in different ways, hospitals and then sometimes out in the community. But she was never free of the mental health system. She never lived completely independent of it. In the groups when I knew her, what I experienced from her was her spiritual anguish and her self-loathing and her feelings of guilt and feeling like she was evil and alienated from God. But it wasn't until I began to read her journals that I began to see what an extraordinary journey this woman had been on alone, because she was too afraid to talk to anybody about her journey for fear that it would just be one more nail in the coffin of her diagnosis. So in these journals, what she would do is she had a page, and at the top of the page she would put down both daily activities and then feelings. And so it'd be like smoking, eating, shower, made my bed, cleaned my room, and then feelings of guilt, joy, happiness, sadness, depression, anger, whatever. And then she would mark it with a check. She would go through this by columns. And then at the bottom of many, many, many pages, she had the question, where did God come to me today? And then she would put down, things like, well, I found the ability to be grateful, or I was kind to so-and-so when I really wanted to bite his head off, or. And so what I began to see was she was on this pursuit by herself of what was her illness and where was God, and how could she make sense of this? And it wasn't until she joined one of my groups that anybody had ever asked her about that. Now, even in the group, she didn't reveal the depth of her search that I have since learned from her journals. She was quite a writer, and she wrote an article entitled, Does God Come to the Seclusion Room? And then she also wrote poetry, and she was so intellectually inquisitive that up until 3 months before she died, she was taking a course on calculus. She carried around in her little satchel vocabulary cards so that she could improve her English vocabulary and learn French. And then she had calculus cards with formulas on them. So she was somebody who was always pushing herself against enormous odds. Now, I want to read you a couple of lines from a page that she wrote that's called A Philosophy for My Life. Excuse me. In this, she says, she calls it a philosophy for my life, especially if I am in pain. And then in quotes, or in parentheses, she puts written in pain. And she says, "The purpose of life, to love the Lord my God with all my heart, all my mind, and all my soul, and to love my neighbor as myself. Secondly, to endure to the end as lovingly, productively, and courageously as I can, to never commit suicide." She made several suicide attempts. "And thirdly, to work steadily for the lessening of my pain and the pain of those about me." And then she goes on to say, "When feeling evil, I should check it out and read my reasons for believing I am not a devil. You are a better person when you feel better about yourself, so seeing yourself realistically in a better light is good for you and those about you." And then she goes on and she says, "When you have failed, accept God's and others, accept God's, others, and your own forgiveness as soon as possible. This will help. Take up your bed and walk." And then her PS is, "Talk about the depression, its severity, seeming to flow into every part of your being. Talk about the deterioration, real or imagined. If you have 4 hours of relief a day, rejoice in those 4 hours. Not belabor the 12 hours of pain. Ask God for ways to be helpful to others, like being a good follower." That's not the right word. Ask God for ways to be helpful to others, like being, I think it's follower. Now, this was a woman who had every diagnosis under the sun. She was diagnosed manic depressive, schizoaffective, borderline, paranoid schizophrenic, depression, and she, as I said, she made suicide attempts, and it was only on her deathbed when I went to see her that I realized why, even in the hottest days of summer, that she wore long sleeve shirts, and that was because both arms were slashed with ways in which she had cut herself over the years. So when you think of someone like that, this, what I read and this search that she was on, and then the anguish that she was coping with most of the time, it's quite traumatic. And I will say, I think she died at peace, and she died knowing that she was beloved by the community. And at a memorial service, it was extremely touching to hear how honest people could be about her. I mean, that they could recognize that she was someone who could really push people's buttons. I mean, unbelievably, And yet they could see all of the goodness and all of the struggle and all of the power in her. But I absolutely believe that she's somebody whose faith kept her going, that was the driving force of her life, and she was just trying to figure out when it made sense and when it was part of her illness, and that was a piece of her. And the second person that I want to talk about is a person who also said I can use his name. His name is Bob, and he became the second reason for my wanting to write this book, because he too was diagnosed with cancer, had 3 bouts of cancer, and in January of 2003 died with his 3rd bout of cancer. And when he knew that he wasn't going to survive, I asked him if I could start interviewing him in order to write this book, and he was thrilled with the idea that someone was going to write a book about him, because his life was absolutely poor in every single respect of that word. He had grown up in an Irish family. There were 7 children. They lived in a 4 or 5 room apartment in Cambridge. As he said, we were dirt poor. His father worked for the city, which meant he was a garbage collector. They never had a piece of furniture that came anywhere from off the streets until he bought his mother a sofa when he had earned enough money. Both of his parents were alcoholic. So just to start life, he had all of that against him. When he was 16, he was hit with his first depression. He came home from school after having seen a kid stab another kid, and started to cry and cried for days, and then didn't go out of the house for 9 months. And as he said about that time, there were times when he felt so awful that if he could have had enough money to buy a rope, he would have bought the rope, but then he didn't think he'd get by with killing himself because the apartment was too small and someone would discover him before he did it. but it was something that he seriously thought about. So at age 16, he ended up at Mass Mental, and again, like Barbara, began a 40-year journey in the mental health system. Now, for most of his life, he lived with his mother, and his father died sooner than his mother, but he lived with his mother, and then after living with his mother, he was able to go and get an apartment on his own. But he too was a very bright man, and he had to drop out of school after his sophomore year because of the depression. And then he got to know some volunteers at the settlement house across the street from the projects that he lived in. And some of them recognizing his intelligence, persuaded him to apply for a scholarship to, I think it was Boston Latin. And not that, it was one of the private schools. Anyway, he got a scholarship, he got in, and they advanced him because they could see that he was really smart. And he was so poor that many times he didn't have enough money for lunch. So what he told me was he would go to the Boston Public Library and he would read all the journals he could find, international journals, in English, so that he could get material for the debate team. And then he said, and we'd kill him. But that was the kind of driving force that he had this intelligence, he had this ambition, and he had people that really supported him. But he couldn't survive. He was hit with another depression, and so he dropped out of school and never graduated from high school. He never got a high school degree. So he too spent years in the mental health system, and he was in my group for about 8 years. And when he was in the group, what he talked mostly about was his rage at God, of what kind of a God would give someone a life like he had, in terms of poverty, ugliness, alcoholism, depression. His one brother whom he loved was killed in Vietnam. I mean, it was just a series of things. And then, as I often refer to mental illness as the great robber, being robbed of a life that he really had ambitions for. He wanted to be a teacher or a policeman, he wanted to have a family, and none of those could he do. So he ended up, just surviving. But he really did more than survive. I mean, over the years, he really became quite a remarkable person in the day treatment program. And he had a niece who was his sister's daughter, and the father had left. I mean, they weren't married, so the father left. And so he basically was a father to this niece of his. And he said a lot of times when he too thought about suicide, it was only Amanda that kept him going, that he couldn't do that to Amanda. And every Friday night, no matter how depressed he was, he would take Amanda to his apartment and fix her dinner when she was little tiny. And all the years up until the time that he died, every Friday night was Amanda's. And so that he felt like that was God's gift to him. Now, given that history that I've just described and his anger at God, but I think because of the group, he was able to talk about his anger at God, and he was really able to let go of some of it. And one day he came to the group and he said, now, I'm not telling anybody what to do. He had a real kind of a tough street way about him. He said, I'm not telling anybody what to do, but I want to tell you all that about 3 months ago, I was just feeling so paranoid and I couldn't get out of my house and I needed to get milk and bread. I didn't have anything to eat in the house. And I didn't know what to do. I was so frightened. And he said, I decided I just got down on my knees and I asked Jesus for help. And he said, after a little while, I got up and I was able to go out and get some food. And he said, so every morning I've been getting down on my knees and asking Jesus for help. And every night I get down on my knees and I thank him. He said, and I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling what works for me, Well, that really was a very defining moment for him. But then when he got hit with the second bout of cancer and the third bout of cancer, it really tested his faith in God. And where was God? But despite all this, he was able to say to me as he was dying, I hate the fact that I can't do more for others. He said, I recognize that I'm really grateful for the small things in my life. And he proceeded to tell me, he said, like lying here, I think of the people who have done something for me, the woman who owned a convenience store and made me cheeseburgers when I had nothing to eat, and she bought me a suit for my brother's funeral. Or the janitor in the projects who spoke to the political people about getting me a scholarship to the school. Or the postman who put stamps on letters to my brother in Vietnam when we couldn't afford stamps ourselves. Now, Bob also had a sense that God had put his finger on him. And he said quite honestly, he said, I know this happened in a manic phase. I know I was manic-y, but I really had a sense that God somehow, he said that there was a sense that God was telling me, you know. And I said to him, well, what was it that you know? And he said, I don't know. It's like the Jewish people who just know that they're chosen for something, and I had that same sense. But what was interesting was, it wasn't a knowing that was a consolation to him. I mean, he really received very little consolation from God in an experiential way. But the way he lived his life was such a sign of God's presence. I mean, both in terms of his sister, his niece Amanda, and the way that he died. I mean, he was so beloved by the community. And he also said to me, he said, the way I think about God is, I don't think God wants the world to end. With all he has created, I think he wants it to go forward. There is more to life than what we see now. We are at the age where God hasn't left us. He is just making us more responsible for our actions. So there was a man who had just about every strike against him in life, and yet who had this incredible sense of how he should be in relation to other people. And I said to him one time, a couple of weeks before he died, I said, you know, maybe it's a couple of months, 2 months, how is it that you can be the way you are and not be angry and, you know, just so enraged? And he said, Nancy, if I'm angry, I'm going to drive people away, and I need to have people near me. So I'm choosing how I want to be. Now, to me, those things were such a sign of God's presence in his life. And the sadness was, he wasn't able to appreciate that, you know. Because I said to him one time, what do you think holy is? And he said, holy is when the person down the hall brings soup in because you don't have soup. And I said, well, Bob, you do that. And he said, well, I never think of myself as holy. I don't even like that word. You know? So I use him as another illustration. The other thing about him was that he was incredibly compassionate. And I think that when the Dalai Lama talks about what his religion is as compassion, I think that's what I see in these people. So they don't always name God's presence in their life as something that they can appreciate or even receive much consolation from. But it's so evident to me in the way they live their life. The third person that I want to very briefly mention, and then I do want to get to your questions, is very few of these people are young at this point, but this man is in his 50s. And he, unlike Bob, grew up in a fairly well-to-do family with a professional father and a stay-at-home mother. And his mental illness didn't hit him until he was really in his early 20s. And as he said, in the 60s, everyone looked a little crazy. So, and I think that's the other thing, is that a lot of times when mental illness hits an adolescent, it's very hard for families sometimes to figure out how much is just being an adolescent and how much is behavior that's really serious or that needs to be paid attention to. And I've seen that in a lot of people that I've worked with, that if we know now, if we knew then what we know now, a lot of these people's paths probably would be different. But we didn't know that. And so Russell was somebody who, you know, dropped out of college, and it was in the 60s, headed out to California, played around with drugs, played around with alcohol, ended up in a marriage that didn't last very long, left the person and later found out that she was pregnant, and so he has a son. And at the age of 29 started hearing voices. And he was somebody who kind of was just really wandering, and would drop in and out of things. And at one point found the Buddhist meditation group out in California and was a part of that for a while. And then ended up, on the streets and, very psychotic. And so he was going to be hospitalized, and he asked the policeman to call his mother, and so she gave him a plane ticket to fly him back out here. But basically, his life also has been very involved in the mental health system. But unlike Barbara and Bob, the path that's really worked for him is the Buddhist tradition. And he found that when he came back to Boston, he got involved in the Zen Center in Central Square. And he says, this is a quote from him, he says, "The Buddhist teaching says it takes a great question, great faith, and great courage to follow a spiritual path. I see the great courage for me in dealing with all my hospitalizations and severe suicide attempts. For me, the practice keeps clearing out the stuff that gets in my way, the bad karma that takes me off course. Meditation helps me be aware of the present moment. I can let go of things as they develop, the extreme sadness, the extreme anger. I come back to what is true and pure. I still question the meaning of my life, and I don't really understand what it is, but I am more comfortable not knowing. I also know I have a real appreciation for my life these days. I know I care about others, and others care about me. I'm the beloved uncle of 2 nephews and a niece, and I am close to my brother and sister." So in different ways, I think these 3 people illustrate how much a person with mental illness can and often does pursue a spiritual path. Now, what I'd like to do is look at some of the questions, and the one that first comes to my mind in relation to these people and the question up there is the question of when people are sick, how does faith help them? Or they oftentimes don't have an experience that it's helping them. And I would say, I think that's absolutely right, that people don't have an experience when they're really sick, or when they're sick, of experiencing the way faith can be a sustenance. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself, because I think it illustrates that. That shortly after, my mother died in July of '99, and we had a very good relationship, so I was grieving her death, but I didn't have a lot of unfinished business. And in January of that next year, 2000, I just hit a dark hole, the likes of which I had never known in my whole life. And, and I thought, well, this is just the grieving process, and I have to go through it, and give myself time. And in that process, I was doing all of the things that I've always done. I was praying, I was going to Mass, I was writing in my journal. I had a great book, The Jewish Cottage, The Jewish Year of Mourning. And I was writing in that, and nothing seemed to touch the depression. So finally, a friend of mine said, you really don't need to feel this bad, that you should get some medication. Well, I wasn't opposed to medication, it just had never even occurred to me. So I went after, this was by probably April or May, and I got some medication, and I took it, and it did help, it did make a difference. And I am always grateful for that experience, because it was the first time I realized that all the things I had been saying to my clients over the years, well, if you could take care of yourself, if you could go out and take a walk, if you could do something that's nurturing, if you could pray, you might feel better. And what I learned then is when you're in the grips of something like that, none of those things seem to make a difference. So what I came to was the idea that faith is like a compass, that it keeps us pointing due north, but we don't feel, it's like it gets us through the forest because it points us due north, but we don't see the light at the time. We don't see the path. It just keeps us in a certain direction. So I think for people who are struggling with some kind of illness, whether it's physical or mental, having some kind of a practice that's regular can really be useful, even when it isn't felt to be helpful. I think that's what someone like Rick illustrates, that whether he likes it or not, whether he feels like it or not, he does his Zen practice of sitting 3 times a day. And I think what happens over time is that it starts to, you recognize that you are continuing to keep going. You know, it's not that at the time it feels good or that you have a sense of God's presence or anything like that, but it keeps you going. And I think that's what we mean by faith in the face of illness that mostly preoccupies us just with the illness. I also say to people that the problem is that people compare the times when they feel like they've had faith, you know, with times of consolation, that you have a sense of God's presence, or you have a sense of peace, or you have a sense of joy, or you have a sense of energy or gratitude. And then when you lack those things, you think you're lacking faith. What you're lacking is the feeling about those things. You know, so you may not be feeling gratitude, but it doesn't mean that you aren't grateful. You may not be feeling God's peaceful presence, but it doesn't mean that God isn't present. And so I think that we have to really try to distinguish for people that difference of what we feel and what we don't feel. It's like, you know, we know the sun is out there when the sky is gray. You know, it's that kind of relationship, I think, to things that we know that can sometimes help people. And it also, like people like Barbara, I think it also really helps when people can talk about it, you know. When people can, because when people like Barbara have to struggle with their own question about where is God, am I a devil, am I an evil, do I not feel this because I've been bad, is God punishing me? When there's someone to bounce that off against, it can make all the difference in the world, even though people's assurance may not change the way you feel right at the time. Now, people saying to me when I felt depressed, you know, but you know that you're this and you're that. Well, it didn't make a difference, you know? And I think that's what's so awful about mental illness. Now, let me turn to... Okay, I think that answers, to some extent, this question. I think that having some kind of a spiritual practice, either for the family who's suffering with the person with mental illness, or for the person who is suffering with the mental illness themselves. Now, it's hard to go there when you're hit with the illness. You know, I mean, some people do turn to God when they get sick. Other people turn away from God when they get sick. But it does help to have some kind of a foundation that you can draw on when you're sick. But it doesn't mean that you can't get there. Because I've seen in working with the people I have over the years, just allowing people an opportunity to talk about some of this, and also helping people to recognize the spiritual part of their life, you know, like for some of these people, recognizing their incredible kindness and compassion when they're feeling so awful about themselves, that's a sign, whether you use the word God or not, but it is a sign of the Spirit at work. I mean, when we talk about the gifts of the Spirit, you know, when you see that in action, and I think oftentimes people, when you can affirm that for people, then they start to see that in themselves. Sometimes it takes a long time, though. So I would say, yes, it helps, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it at the time. In terms of background or events for alum regarding spirituality, I mean, I think there are all kinds of possibilities. But I also think that people who have grown up in the religious tradition sometimes don't think of themselves as spiritual, and helping people think about how they are spiritual. I mean, what are the things that nourish them? I mean, there are so many things that you could probably do, and Susan probably has a ton of ideas in terms of things to offer for the alumni, but I'd have to think more about it. I mean, I hope something that, you know, I've said tonight might spark off something like that. I think the question of building healthy lifestyles, I mean, whether we struggle with mental illness or physical illness or just life, I think the whole question of, you know, even thinking about Lent as a positive way to think about how can we build in healthier lifestyles? How do we all take better care of ourselves, you know? instead of feeling so driven by so many things, and that make us feel so out of control most of the time. And so how do we kind of get our spirits back in our own control? How do we get our lives back in our own control? And what are the things that we need to do to get there, you know? What are the disciplines that we need? Because I do think that we need disciplines, you know. Having come from religious life when it was extremely structured and disciplined, and then abandoning it all at a certain point in my life, and then going back to it in a much more conscious and choiceful way because I saw the value of it. So, and again, that goes back with the spiritual practice, you know. Just choosing to say for 5 minutes a day, I'm going to sit still and do nothing, you know. Or when I get in the car, I'm not always going to turn on the radio. Or, you know, and Barbara in her philosophy of life says, when we talk about healthy lifestyle, she says, work on moderation, especially in smoking and eating, and remember when you fail, you can try again and again. So, I think that people, let's see, the question, people with illness and spirituality waning. See, that's the trouble, I can't always.
Oh.
Yeah, you read.
I raised it in the context of patients.
Oh, right.
Uh,
I think that the more healthcare providers can talk to patients about their spirituality or their beliefs, first of all, it brings it to the surface. It affirms it in them, and it shows that you're going to take it seriously. So that, you know, because when it gets left out, as in Barbara's case, she's left with the struggle. She's not going to bring it up if she fears that it's going to be diagnosed as a part of her symptoms. So it adds to her turmoil. It doesn't decrease it. And I honestly, this I absolutely believe, that when, and it goes along with the question of hyper-religiosity, when you ask a person about their beliefs, what do they believe, you know, about their religious tradition, about their history, what they learned in their family, 99% of the time, people themselves distinguish between what makes sense and what doesn't, what's healthy and what's not healthy, or what's a part of their illness and what seems to make more sense. For example, a person who's manic depressive will say to me, when I get more religious, that's not a good sign, it means I'm getting sicker. Another person might say, when I get more religious, I know that's a good sign because I know I'm getting better. So that people, I think the one thing that I'd like to leave with you tonight is that when people have a mental illness, all of them is not sick. Mental illness doesn't destroy a person's entire mind and emotional reaction. It affects a part of them, but there's always a part that's a kind of observing, that's kind of healthy. Now, maybe not when they're absolutely in the grips of a psychotic delusion, but after the fact, people many times can see what that was. I mean, some of the people in my group have told me, you know, one time we were in a meeting, and 3 of them were talking about the time when they were John the Baptist, and they were all comparing notes on how they tried to baptize people. And they were saying it with a lot of humor. You know, they knew that was crazy. They knew that they weren't John the Baptist, but at the time they didn't know that. So when people get a little distance from being in the total grips of their symptoms, they can often assess, you know, where they're at. The problem is a lot of the caregivers haven't made peace with their own religious traditions and their own histories. And so they're leery about bringing this up because they don't want to be questioned about it. They don't want the person to say, well, doctor, what do you believe? You know, or what do you think? You know? So if people have unresolved issues, if caregivers have unresolved issues, they're not going to feel comfortable in bringing this up. But when you bring it up for people, more often than not, they can really talk very coherently about this part of their life. I think the whole question of the relationship to other healing arts, I mean, I think the more we can learn from each other and the more we can incorporate the rich richness of various traditions, whether it's medical traditions, healing traditions, spiritual traditions, I think the richer we all are. So that for some people, an Eastern practice like a Zen practice can be helpful. You know, some of the people that I work with find belonging to a religious community helpful. Others find it very problematic and can't go near any kind of institutional religion. So I think respecting people's path and understanding where they're coming from is really important. I think the question about the patient becoming hyper-religious, again, more often than not, I think a person is often trying to get people's attention to talk to them about it, rather than, so that if a person is talking a lot about religion, it's like, what are they trying to tell us? And do they feel like anybody's hearing them? You know, because you know how we have to keep saying something over and over and over again if we feel like nobody's hearing us? You know, and once someone hears us, we stop saying it, you know? So I think a lot of times now sometimes hyper-religiosity can be a symptom, you know? If a person is going through a lot of religious behaviors in kind of an obsessive-compulsive way, that can be a part of their symptom. But again, it's important to talk to them about it. You know, what's going on? What do they want us to hear? Do they feel heard? And then also to think about what's the symbolic message in the language that they're using, you know. Is there kind of a meta message in that? Because all communication is about wanting to be understood. So even hyper-religiosity is an effort to communicate something, you know. And so I think the more we can try to listen without diagnosing or defining or being frightened by it, I think that the better off that we are. The book that I referred to called Lying Awake is actually about, it's a novel, but it's about a Carmelite nun who was having mystical experiences and finally, but also accompanied with terrific headaches, and finally she's taken to a doctor and the doctor diagnoses it as an epileptic disorder and so suggests that she be put on medication. And was it medication and surgery? Maybe it was both. Anyway, she goes ahead with the treatment and her mystical experiences cease. But again, I think that the whole question of mystical experiences is a question of, and even the mystics would say this, the point is not the mystical experiences, the point is how we choose to live our lives. You know, so if the medication is helping the person live life better, even though it may not feel as rich, then is that, you know, is that a value? So even as gratifying as the mystical experience might be, there may be a downside to not taking medication too. So I think it's a question of which feels worse. You know, the depression or the felt, again, it's a felt absence of God. It's not the absence of God. It's the felt absence of God. I think the question about the clinical setting, how to balance the spirituality and psychology and dealing with patients, I think that question really has to do with the fact that if you're in a clinical setting and what you're interested in is understanding this person that you're working with as thoroughly as possible, then understanding their religious or spiritual history is a part of that understanding. And that you're not crossing boundaries when you try to explore that with people. And that's a lot of the training that I do, of trying to help people understand that this is just an important part of a lot of people's lives. And you'll understand them better, both what's problematic for them, because in a lot of people's lives, their religious tradition has been problematic, or what's helpful to them in the sense of where there's a sense of support or strength for them. So if we're clinicians, if we're healthcare providers, and we're focused on understanding the person, then I don't think that we have any problem about crossing boundaries. Because we're not making recommendations that this person ought to go back to church, or they ought to pray, or they ought to have a spiritual practice, they ought, that really isn't our role as clinicians. Our role is to understand and to bring to light the things that would be helpful helpful to the person. I've thought a lot in Boston in the last couple of years and wondered when the adolescents who have since come forward and said that they were abused by clergy, if they were seeing therapists when they were adolescents, I wonder how many therapists ever asked them about their religious past, their religious tradition. And if they had, if some of this wouldn't have come to light a lot sooner. But my hunch is that a lot of them were just treating them as depressed, suicidal adolescents who needed to be put on medication and who needed to be contained. And they never asked about that. Now, I don't know that for sure, but given the fact that these things were happening 20 years ago, it wouldn't surprise me. So we never know what we're going to unearth when we try to find out about a person's religious past. And sometimes it's really quite revealing and quite helpful. I think that people in the psychiatric field who are hostile, I do think that that's changing a lot over the, from when I first started to do this. I don't think I encountered overt hostility, but I encountered more covert, resistance and hostility. People would just forget about me, or they'd forget to ask these questions, or it would come up once and then it wouldn't come up for 3 months, so that there was kind of a resistance that was played out more, I would say, covertly. But I do think that there's a lot of changes have taken place in the psychiatric world, and more there are psychiatric training programs that are incorporating the whole question of religion and spirituality into their training programs. That certainly is true in psychology. At the American Psychiatric Association meeting, at the American Psychological Association meeting, now there are 15, 20 workshops that have something to do with something about spirituality or religion, or incorporating it into treatment. So there's been a huge difference in that. I think that when you meet real hostility, my sense is that it's always more about the therapist than it is, that there's something in the person's own background that is unresolved and they just can't go there. Either they've got too much anger, or they're too much in doubt about what they believe, and there are all kinds of issues. But I think that it isn't nearly the climate that it used to be, and hopefully that will continue to change. Now, let me just stop there and see if there are any questions. And then I want to end with a poem. Yes, Diane?
I just wondered if Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, that came out, I guess, in the 80s, and that really was about, his observation of people that had some spiritual foundation. Their prognosis, they got better. The majority of them, people that believed, had a better chance of success. And I wonder, was that any kind of a groundbreaking work? I mean, it began to raise the sensibilities and bring it on a level of the common man, so that, people were talking about it kind of on the street.
Right. I think that's true, Diane. I think that what was happening, and I don't think anybody's really done a thorough sociological study of this, but I think that what was beginning to happen in the 80s was that there were different strains that were starting to converge. Something like that was one. Another big thing was the success of AA. And people started to look at why was AA having such a successful rate in terms of people relapsing. And then looking at the spiritual component. Now, AA takes a very rigid stand about not being religious, but certainly the spiritual component. There were people like David Larson, who was a psychiatrist who died tragically on a treadmill 2 years ago. And he got interested in looking at he was Episcopalian, and he got interested in looking at whether religion and spirituality was considered in research studies. So he was a kind of an obsessive guy. So he went back through all of the major psychiatric journals for 10 years, looking at whether religion or spirituality was ever a variable, and came up with the statistics of, in how many journals it was like in only 5% was it mentioned, and in those 5% when it was 2% of the time it was positive. And he ended up getting a lot of Templeton money and started 3 conferences on the question of, looking at this issue. So I think there were different, like nothing happened, there's not just one thing, but I think probably you could say in the late 70s and early 80s there were these different strains that were starting to come, into focus. started to emerge and then, kind of develops after that, so kind of every petal in the pond.
Nancy, two things very quickly. In terms of clinical research, I'm going to struggle with these names. Meyer-Minruth clinics throughout Texas, they wrote with Fowler and Hempfeld a book called Path to Serenity, and basically they conclude in studying obsessive compulsive behavior that there was a tendency towards more success with patients who had a better concept of their relationship to a God. And the example they give is that less success with someone who looked at the light bulb versus someone who had a personal God. And they have a lot of case studies in that book. The other thing was in telling your Bob story, Robert de Blasi, I have his tape. I don't know his book. He refers to his book in his tape in which he describes the background to what is called the Jesus Prayer, which is a 4th century practice. Hesychia, I think, is the Greek name, which is really a mantra of Jesus' name, and has several examples in the tape of people who broke out of severe paranoia, depression, after employing that practice over a period of time. And certainly in both those circumstances, they would be encouraging to your focus and study.
Well, and that reminds me of, Herbert Benson, who's over at Harvard. The way he got interested in this whole idea of religion was he started doing the relaxation response with people and suggested that they use a word. And he was saying, things like beauty, life, whatever. And he began to notice that people who used words from their religious tradition seemed to do a little bit better. So then he started pursuing that. So if a person used Jesus or Allah or Yahweh, there seemed to be a better response rate. So he kind of came at this not because of his own religious tradition or belief in it, but because he started to see that it made some kind of a difference.
And apparently de Blasi had some involvement at Harvard in a similar capacity. So.
Any other?
Well, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
I'm very much struck by my own experience with depression, and hearing you talk about how you talk to people about the life of the spirit. And I think for me, in serious depression, when you lose your sense of self, so that you lose your relationship with yourself, and you can lose your relationship with everything around you. And so not only do you lose relationship with the people around you, but you also lose relationship with God. So everything becomes missed. So you have nothing that you're connected to. So that for me, the work of the therapist or the counselor, whatever, is to keep reminding people, because it's so lost. But if you keep, as you say, true north, but you need help remembering that. You can't remember it by yourself in that situation.
That's really true. And I think that's why Barbara's story was so remarkable, because what she did was she went back to her journals to remind herself, because there wasn't anybody else outside her that was reminding herself. And I think that's really true. That's why we need community. Any other questions, comments, reflections? Okay, I'm going to end with this poem. This is by Denise Levertov, who's not one of my clients. I had grasped God's garment in the void, but my hand slipped on the rich silk of it. The everlasting arms my sister loved to remember must have upheld my leaden weight from falling. Even so, for though I claw at empty air and feel nothing, no embrace, I have not plummeted. Oh, thank you. Thank you for coming